Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second in our Beer and Brexit series. I'm delighted that we were able to do Nicky Morgan a favour and save her for what must be a very boring day in Parliament.
Yeah, nothing going on.
Give us something worthwhile to do over this end of town. Let me start, as we do, with a very brief bio. Nicky, of course, had what is almost the definition of a meteoric political career. Elected in 2010, which seems about an age and a half ago now. She was an almost ever-present, I think, in the Cameron government, rising to Education Secretary before now ending up as Chair of the Treasury Select Committee. You see, because you're our guest, I missed out the bit in the middle where you went from Minister to not. A few fun facts that we managed to dig out. Firstly, she was tipped by James Forsyth in 2015 as one to watch, so well done. Apparently you're known as Nemo amongst your friends.
Apparently so.
But if nothing else, that served as a great excuse for our team to sit and watch the bloody film all afternoon in the office to try and find a good line.
Lovely.
Yes. Another claim to fame, I suppose, is that she was beaten to the presidency of the Oxford University Conservative Association by
Daniel Hannan.
Congratulations. I hope that's not on your CV. And finally, she's on the advisory council of the liberal conservative think tank Bright Blue, alongside her former cabinet colleague, Justine Greening, of whom more in a short while, I can assure you.
All right.
So let me start. I mean, this is actually going to be the first question every time now, because it seemed like a good one for you. Are you enjoying your job at the moment?
Well, of course, as a member of Parliament, well, good evening. Thank you very much for being here on this rather warm evening. And as you said, there's nothing much going on at all. It's all very quiet in Parliament. So forgive me, I'm going to keep an eye on my phone because things are changing all the time as amendments are being debated. So I have two jobs, I suppose, at the moment. I also have Chair of the Treasury Select Committee in the House of Commons, which is a fabulous role. I'm really, really enjoying it. For me, it's part of sort of going home, if you like. I spent 16 years working in the City of London as a solicitor before I was elected. And so it's an environment that I feel like I suppose at home in. But I'm also, of course, still very much a Member of Parliament for Loughborough. And I think people tend to forget that role, particularly in London and the commentariat. But actually that is, and we're going to come on, I think, to discuss it, that is what shapes, I think, all of us in terms of how we approach the job, particularly the whole Brexit debate at the moment. And it's what our representative democracy is pretty vital, and it's been put under huge strain in the past 2 years.
So, I mean, yes, let's talk about Loughborough then. So Loughborough is roughly 50-50 in the referendum, I think, and you've got a majority of about 5,000?
Just about 4,000, yes, 4,300, just round that number.
So,
yeah.
if I can put it crudely, what is more likely to lose you your job? Your position on Brexit or the Prime Minister's position on Brexit?
Well, I think, look, at the end of the day, much as we all flatter ourselves as candidates that we all have a personal following and that we win elections, I think, really, people vote for the National Party. So I think, actually, what's likely to lose me a seat like Loughborough and the Conservative Party, anything resembling having more seats than anybody else in Parliament, is us falling apart over this process and being completely disunited. You know, I wrote an article this morning. We've been here before in the 1990s. We know what happens. We don't have to repeat it.
Okay, we'll come back to talk a bit more substantively about the government, but I think you implied at the time that the reason you lost your cabinet job in July 2016 was because you'd had a disagreement with the then Home Secretary over some of her ideas about immigration policy and schools. Is that true?
Well, I don't know in the sense of when you're handed your P45 by the Prime Minister, it's a fairly swift exit interview. It's about 2.5 minutes long, and that included me recommending my then brilliant PPS Robin Walker for a job in government. He was given a job in Dexu, so I'm not entirely sure that he's thanked me for that opportunity. But he's still there, and others aren't. So I did ask her why, and she didn't tell me that I was being asked to leave the cabinet. I suspect it was partly that, in the sense that I think that Prime Minister wants to have people around them that they feel are very much on their side, and perhaps she didn't feel that about me. And of course I didn't back her in the leadership contest, and I think that was also a big factor. But of course at the time the Prime Minister she still does have an influential Chief of Staff, but Gavin Barwell is a completely different kettle of fish from Nick Timothy and Fiona Hill, who I don't want to dwell on, but if you want to know more about them, read the Tim Shipman books, both of which are brilliant. The books rather than the Chiefs of Staff, okay?
Don't come here and plug other people, if that's okay. But on this, did you get the impression that Mrs May was the sort of woman who doesn't take well to disagreement with her?
I think that would be a fair thing to say. And I think that she had very firm views. And of course, you only have to look in the Home Office, where there were some very good ministers who it was always rather inexplicable that they either didn't last very long in the Home Office and, of course, then weren't appointed when she became Prime Minister. And whether it was her, as I say, or whether it was the team around her who didn't want troublesome cabinet ministers asking too many questions or having too many of their own ideas, that's in some ways that's understandable. But I think actually what we're seeing play out over the next couple of years from those decisions in 2016 is that you do need to have your ideas tested. And the best place to test them is amongst your ministerial team, if it's in a department, or your cabinet, so that when they are unleashed on the public, actually they have been probed to death. And, we're going to come on to it, but one of the reasons I think we're in the position we're in about Brexit is we didn't have a proper leadership contest 2 years ago, when lots of ideas about what Brexit meant and what the Conservative Party thought Brexit meant would have been tested, probably in some cases, to destruction then. Do
you think Mrs May's predecessor should have done some contingency planning, maybe?
Well, it's difficult. I'm a huge fan of David Cameron's. I really enjoyed working with him. He and George Osborne were extremely good bosses. I know people have strong views, but they should have strong views of people in those positions. And the honest truth was that I think we did think that people were going to ultimately, or the Remain campaign would win. And I think there is always that battle in government about how much time and money do you invest in a scenario you think is not going to happen. And we're seeing that play out with the no-deal preparations at the moment. But I think it would be fair to say, there wasn't the contingency planning for a leave vote. I think we've all learned huge lessons from that.
Given what we've just said about Mrs May and disagreement, have you been surprised subsequently by what cabinet ministers have been able to get away with?
Well, I think it'd be fair to say that our former Foreign Secretary has pushed the bounds of did push the bounds of collective responsibility about as far as anybody had ever done. And I think, in a way, the whole the Brexit thing is that it crosses party boundaries, it crosses sort of personal boundaries in terms of friendships and alliances, and that's why I think Theresa May was completely right about 10 days ago to say I am now absolutely making it crystal clear collective responsibility applies, because people have been going too far out of what they say that ability to stick to a line together. So yes, and of course I was surprised, but it really was only one person who was doing that again and again and again, and he's no longer in cabinet.
Okay, now your relationship with Theresa May, I think it's probably fair to say that it took a bit of a downturn that Christmas when she wore those chocolate trousers. Actually, I have a confession to make over the chocolate trousers, because like that lady in the lift just now, when I saw the headline, my first thought was, don't they melt? And I didn't realise it was a colour rather than a material. But have your relations improved since that falling out?
They have. I don't think she's going to write me around for drinks anytime soon. But I don't think that's the kind of person that Theresa May is. But yes, we have had meetings, we've had conversations, and particularly over recent weeks, there's been lots of toing and froing on amendments and debates about bills and all the rest of it. And we've had some good conversations about that.
Do you think she's an electoral asset to the party?
Well, I think the extraordinary thing about this was that she was a huge electoral asset to the party at the start of the last general election campaign. I mean, people really, on the doorsteps in a constituency like Loughborough, people wanted her to succeed, particularly older women. They really wanted her to win. They were impressed. They thought she was a person that got on with tackling the difficult issues, an end to the kind of spin of David Cameron and Tony Blair, and that's what they liked. And it just shows how electoral fortunes can change so quickly. The manifesto and the social care announcements did change that. But, even now, I'm on the record as saying I don't think Theresa May is the person that's going to lead us into the next general election. But even now in the country, and I think probably more as Conservative MPs misbehave, actually people still wish her well. And the common sentiment in a place like Loughborough, which I would regard as, very sensible, down-to-earth, Middle England, is she has an almost impossible task on her hands. We might disagree with some of the decisions that she makes, but we wish her well in doing it.
But you still don't think she should lead the Conservative Party into the next election?
I don't.
Why?
Because I think that being an election, fronting up a party, being a leader in an election, requires a different skill set from the one that she has. Does have that ability to get down into the depths, into the detail. She ran the Home Office incredibly efficiently. She's not a person, I think, who enjoys particularly the spotlight. I mean, I think she does these things because that's obviously what's required of her as Prime Minister. But her natural instinct, and I think we have seen this with Brexit and the Chequers white paper, has not been to get out there and to really to sell it. It's been to say, look, here are the positions. I think they're well argued. I think this is right. I think we want people to make up their own minds. And I think a different skill set is needed. Or alternatively, what you have in a general election is you make sure you have a team around you, so that it's not just about one person, it's about the team, and there's complementary skills. And that's what Tony Blair used to do with John Prescott, for example. I mean, they were deliberately a pairing that appealed to different sections of the Labour vote. And so if you know, for example, that your forte is not doing debates or fronting up party political broadcasts, then you make sure, I'd have thought, that you have a number 2 or a number 3 or whatever. You're a team, a triumvirate, for example, and each of you's got your skills, and people can see this is a group of people who work together, who like each other, who work together as a team. And again, though, the mistake last year was the election campaign was made all about one person in, I think, a very unfair way.
Okay, I mean, you mentioned her record as Home Secretary, so I suppose this follows on. Would you accept the fact that the outcome of the referendum was partly a reaction against the policies of the Cameron government? And I mean that in 2 ways. Partly austerity, so start with that actually the squeeze on public services that austerity led to was part of the reason that turned people against EU membership. I mean, wrongly, probably.
The answer is no, I wouldn't agree with that. I think perhaps people didn't articulate it. If you're going to go on and talk about immigration, I do think, and again, I wouldn't have said it was the coalition government's policies on immigration. Undoubtedly, there are people in this country absolutely who disagree with those, and I think we've seen with Windrush the fallout from those policies. But I think that the referendum was about, and this is where your work has been, I think, very valuable. Definitely about immigration, globalisation. And in a way, a bit about the economy is not working for us. So the big thing, I think, is the lack of wage growth over the course of the decade and continuing resentment, which I pick up as chair of the Treasury Select Committee, to the banks and financial services sector, which was a kind of, these people were bailed out with a lot of money, nobody was ever held accountable, and yet we can't find the money for my hospital, my school, whatever. So I suppose it was a little bit perhaps tied in with austerity there, but I don't think it was put in those terms. It was very much, the world is changing, and I'm not sure that I'm prepared for it, or I'm not sure the government's policies are preparing my children, my grandchildren for it, and I don't actually like the country that this is becoming.
But part of that was a sense of bitterness, annoyance, anger at the fact that some parts of society were doing all right under these. I mean, and there is evidence out there that the austerity policies disproportionately hit the worse off. Yep.
Well, but then you could argue, I mean, as I would, that Brexit's going to also hit the less well off very hard, and yet many people voted for it. So I'm not sure that... Look, it's very difficult, I think, particularly for somebody who has a stronger view as me on Brexit, to unpick and second-guess why people voted. Because every time I do it, I'm reliably informed via Twitter messages and via email that I've got it completely wrong and that I clearly don't know what I'm talking about. And who are you to second-guess why anybody voted to leave? And yet, like other MPs, I have masses of conversations with people on a whole spectrum of views on Brexit. So I think I wouldn't say people have I wouldn't go back to immigration was absolutely a reason. There was definitely, not necessarily thinking that it was all EU immigration, just immigration as a whole, a perception of society changing. And I think that we haven't had the intelligent conversation about immigration in this country that we needed to. There's all sorts of reasons for that. But I think I wouldn't say austerity, but I would say this country, the economy is not working for everybody in this country. I mean, it is extraordinary, for example, that people in Sunderland, where you've got a massive car plant, employing lots of people, good jobs, secure jobs, and yet people there voted to, many people voted to leave. There's something else going on there as well.
And do you get confronted a lot on the doorstep by leavers who think that you're selling them out or betraying them, or?
Well, I mean, obviously, Brexit's been different phases. So certainly, when I started being very vocal, you know, in 2016 and into 2017, and at the general election last year, I did get a lot of people who were very pro-Brexit saying, you know, actually, why can't you accept that we're leaving? Why are you asking these questions? Why won't you support the Prime Minister? You know, and then actually when you unpick it and you explain what's going on, and I think one of the easiest things has been to lob at people like me, has been very much, it's all about undoing the referendum, not respecting the result, trying to stymie us leaving the EU, which is why many of us took the decision to do things like support the triggering of Article 50 and the withdrawal bill and everything else, which I know seems counterintuitive. But, you know, you've got to get over that in order to have debate, which is what we're now having about the how do we leave of Brexit. But yes, I get a lot of very impassioned people, both locally, but also clearly, you know, on email and Twitter. But I get a lot of impassioned people the other way. You know, never before have I had an issue where I've got people rushing up to me at tube stations in London, you know, in restaurants, people saying, keep going, thank you so much for everything you're doing. And all of my colleagues report the same.
Okay. If you'd been in charge of the negotiations from the start, how would you have done them differently, if at all, from the Prime Minister?
Well, I think there were two big things. I mean, I think what we're now seeing, I think the first thing is the language and rhetoric in autumn 2016 was incredibly hard. And the party conference speech, I think, in 2016 was, there was a sort of deliberate perpetuation of the divisions in the country, when I think actually what was needed was much more of a look, we've had this referendum, people feel very strongly about it, it was very divided. We've now got to, you know, Theresa May could have said, you know, as Prime Minister, we've now got to work, how do we bring people together? How do we have a more unified country, recognising that people are, you know, going to have got a result they either love or they don't like at all? And how do we actually start talking about the compromises and trade-offs that are going to be needed in order to deliver Brexit? And then I think the Lancaster House speech, some very early, very hard red lines drawn, which I'd have said in any negotiation. I think there were 12 things, and that's made it very, very difficult. You know, and has allowed people to say, which is what we're seeing play out now, actually those red lines become a pink, or in fact they've been rubbed out completely. So in a way, rather than sort of moving towards, trying to bring people together, moving towards a common Brexit position where you try to take 80% of the country with you, accepting that 10% on either side are never going to like what's delivered, we started off with a kind of, we're going to go hard for the sort of 50% over here, we're going to ignore the 48%, and then over time, it's been recognised actually we do have to. I mean, you know, the Mansion House speech where Prime Minister used the phrase compromises, last couple of weeks ago when she was in the House after the EU Council Summit, she talked about want to bring the country back together, but it's taken quite a long time to get there.
You don't think the red lines reflected, I mean, albeit imperfectly, what was the spirit of the Leave campaign? Money, immigration, laws? Well,
I think that's how it was interpreted. And I think the Chiefs of Staff who drew that up and everything else, again, we were talking earlier on about, well, you know, why do people vote to leave?
Yeah.
Well, of course, if you're trying to second guess that, and they were trying in those red lines to capture some of that. But I think the other thing is, as a leader, do you follow or do you lead? And do you say to people, look, I understand you want there to be no ECJ jurisdiction. But let me just tell you, we can do that, but actually, inevitably, in our English courts, people will always still look to the European... That's just what lawyers do. They will look to other courts. So let me tell you honestly, we won't have the ECJ making rulings which our courts have got to follow. But the honest truth is that our barristers and our lawyers will always look to other foreign courts, as they do in the Privy Council and other things, to apply to cases in front of them. And those kind of that honesty and those compromises, I think, would have really helped in terms of helping people to get towards a more common position.
Do you think with hindsight it would have been preferable to have had a Brexiter as Prime Minister? Because, I mean, you can't help but feel that with Theresa May she was trying to prove herself to the other side by setting out these. And if you'd had something, in a sort of only Nixon could go to China kind of way, if you'd had a hard Brexiter in charge, they could have...
I came in for enormous amounts of flack about why I supported Michael Gove, but that's exactly why I supported him. Because I felt that it had to be somebody who said, look, I've campaigned to leave, you know where I stand on all of this, but actually, let me just tell you now, this is the way I can deliver this, and this is where the compromise is going to be. And also, The other thing about the Leave vote, as I say, the unhappiness with the way the country's going, a lot of that is nothing to do with the EU at all. That's to do with social reforms that need to happen in our education system and our social care system and in our job market and that sort of thing. And I personally felt that Michael would have had the bandwidth to deliver some of that. I mean, I'd like to have seen over the years perhaps a domestic inner cabinet set up where people like then Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt and Justin Green as Education Secretary were kind of unleashed to do domestic reform, but to come back to the Prime Minister every now and again for an update and everything else, because she's busy negotiating Brexit, which is completely understandable why that's going to take up a lot of her time. And I think it would have helped in terms of bringing people together, saying, I understand. I personally, as former Education Secretary, I think one of the reasons people ended up voting again was, I think, our education system in terms of preparing people for the world of work in the 21st century and giving people skills and confidence and everything else. There's so much that we could be doing there to do that and to say to people, we're on your side, we're going to make sure, don't be frightened about the changing workplace. Actually, we're going to make sure that you've got the skills and we're going to make sure that lifelong learning is possible. So we're going to be on your side with all of this. And that's something that a domestic cabinet, inner cabinet, could easily have taken on whilst, as I say, the Prime Minister was doing Brexit. But hey, that's not what happened.
But purely hypothetically, do you think Michael Gove could do a good job now?
I am not going to get into speculating about anybody else.
Half my questions.
I'm sorry, yes.
Out of the window. Has your view of the EU changed as a function, as these negotiations have unfolded? Well,
so I was EU Budget Minister when I was in the Treasury. So I have sat around that big EU Council table, and I remember walking in and thinking, how on earth does this work? You've got 28 very different countries. So, much as certain newspapers would love to paint me as a total Europhile and all the rest of it, I have always been, to a certain extent, and I think with my legal background, slightly amazed that the whole thing does work. I think what I have learned about this process is that the EU, we have a very different outlook on EU membership and relationship than they do on the continent of Europe. And so, for example, it's taken a long time to understand, when the EU talk about what framework do you want in your new relationship to be, do you want to be Ukraine or Turkey or Canada or Switzerland or Norway? That's not a leading question. That is a genuine, you tell us which one you want to be, and then we can begin to discuss it. So actually where Chequers is right is it talks about an association agreement, which is a concept that the EU understands. Now, we're asking for new things in that association agreement, but the basic framework is something that, for example, I think Verhofstadt has talked about. That's where they can start from. Our British way of doing it, which is a bit of we'd like a bit of this and a bit of that, we'll meld it together and we'll have a bit of chat and everything else, they just can't get their heads around that. So I guess that's one of the things that they've learned. They do see everything very, very literally. And I have some sympathy with the idea that actually they are heading towards a political union, which the UK, citizens of the UK, many of them, including members of my own family, do not want to be part of. I'm not sure I wanted to be part of it. So I can see completely why we have ended up in this position, which is part of the reason why I've also been very clear that we've got to be clear we're leaving, because we've got to take that away and then we focus, as I say, on that future relationship.
But would you agree with those people who accuse the EU of being overly rigid, overly legalistic, overly process-driven? I mean, it's interesting that all the Prime Minister's speeches refer over and over again to the word creativity. We need something creative, and the EU just doesn't seem to. They
don't do creative. So I think to blame them, it's a bit like blaming different nationalities for having blaming the Brits for having a very British sense of humour. I mean, it is what it is, and so you either have to go with the flow. I mean, I think. And that's, of course, why you have a good network of diplomats there, people who spend their time in Brussels, which, again, I don't think we've ever probably quite done as much as other countries in the EU have done to completely understand what it is that they're looking for, which means you get into the discussions, the detail at an earlier stage. I don't think there's any point blaming them to be over-rigid or over-legalistic. That's just the way they are. Okay. So I think you take that and you run with it.
You organised a letter, I think, which was signed by 40-something of your colleagues, and in that letter you called for frictionless trade with the EU. Now, I'd be ever so grateful if you could tell me what frictionless trade with the EU actually means.
Well, I think it means probably keeping things pretty much as they are at the moment, which is, as was the point made in the House this afternoon, we don't have completely trade without friction, but we've got rid of an awful lot of the paperwork and the barriers and everything else. I think we had evidence in the Select Committee that there's about 145,000 SMEs in this country who currently export only to the EU and basically are not used to filling in any paperwork, sort of custom declarations and everything else, at all. And that's an awful lot of companies that are going to have to get used to doing things, potentially doing things differently. But the real thing about the letter, I mean, look, we obviously particularly borrowed language that's been used by the Prime Minister and other ministers as well. The point about the letter was to say, look, the Conservative Party is traditionally a very pro-business, pro-enterprise party. And of course, that was about a week after the former Foreign Secretary had told business to F off. So that is not, I think, where the Conservative Party wants to be. That's not where colleagues wanted to be. And a lot of this has been about demonstrating to ministers, to the Cabinet, actually, this is where the bulk of the parliamentary party is, and I think actually they are behind something like, well, they are behind Chequers, basically. And that's what's always been misleading. It's always been the very vocal ones on either side, and I probably include myself in some of that. There's a lot of my colleagues who very sensibly have tried to sit out this EU debate because they see there's no thanks in getting involved in it.
Could you vote in favour of the Chequers deal?
Yeah.
Perfectly happily?
I wouldn't say perfectly happily, in the sense that I think the whole point is everybody's got questions about it. I, particularly in relation to financial services, obviously with my current role, we know mutual recognition would of course be much better for the City of London, but that's not on the table, and that's going to be almost impossible to negotiate. So I think that Chequers is a sensible step forward. Look, it's not perfect, and there absolutely are questions about it and everything else. But I really think that the sentiment in the country now is please just get on with it. Stop arguing, just get on with it. And Chequers provides a very sensible way forward.
OK, but you're talking about Chequers as an opening gambit. I'm talking about Chequers as a deal. If this was what arrived on the table for the House of Commons towards the end of this process, do you think you could vote for it?
I think so.
Even though it is not in any way, shape or form a soft Brexit, and it certainly won't lead to frictionless trade.
Well, I think that the honest truth is that, as you say, this is it's a position. Our position with the EU is going to evolve over years to come, and I think we are at the stage where we have got to actually have a united position, a deal on the table, something that people live with. I think the country, as I say, the overriding sentiment amongst the party members I speak to and my constituents is please just get on with it and then go and talk about all the other issues we want you to talk about.
If it was on the table, would you support membership of the EEA?
I would be very open to it. I mean, yes, so there is a debate. I mean, there's an amendment down tomorrow about whether some of us vote for it. Part of the difficulty, part of the issue in Parliament at the moment, and we're going to see perhaps some of it play out tonight, maybe more of it tomorrow, is what does the majority across the whole House of Commons want to see in terms of Brexit? And the honest truth at the moment is it appears that the Labour Party, some of the backbenchers are very pro-EEA, EFTA, but the Labour official position is not to back that. So, yes, I would be very interested in EEA membership via something like EFTA. The UK was a founding member of EFTA. It's absolutely a position. And it might even be, I think some of my colleagues see it as a kind of transition point. So we go back to being at EFTA while we continue to negotiate that future relationship.
But some of your colleagues see it as vassal status, and aren't they exactly right on that?
Well, you're never going to have perfection. I mean, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. I suppose I'm less worried about that. At the end of the day, I want to make sure we've got as much certainty as we can have for people to plan. And that what's killing businesses at the moment is the uncertainty.
So you're not scared that we end up sort of going around in circles? That if we ended up in an EEA, Conservative Party divisions would remain the same. There's the danger that Farage would decide to visit us again and start. I mean, well, look, as I wrote that whole debate would open up again.
But I think the debate's going to be there. I mean, there are going to be people clearly in this country who are very unreconciled, either on either way. There will be people who will be campaigning for us to rejoin the EU for many, many years to come. There are people for whom it's not hard enough, as my husband says, unless we actually tow the UK out into the middle of the Atlantic. For some people, that'll still be too close to the EU. So, we've got to find a halfway house between that. As I wrote this morning, frankly, if the Conservative Party thinks that the right answer to what's the Brexit deal is what keeps UKIP killed off, then that is the wrong answer for the rest of the country.
How did you feel when the government accepted the European Research Group's amendments today?
Very, very angry. And we're going to see this part of the reason. I mean, I think we are seeing what's going to happen and whether some amendments, there will be a vote, in which case a number of us will vote not to accept those amendments. And we think that the Labour Party and others will vote with us on that.
Why are the ERGs so much more effective than, I was going to say, you lot? I mean, the soft Brexiters or the Remainers in the Conservative Parliamentary Party. There's a lot of talk about Dominic Grieve being the Grand Old Duke of York the other week when he didn't vote for his own amendment. These people seem to be willing to fight for what they want and get it, whereas on the other side of the party there seems to be quite a lot of retreats. Why?
Well, I think I was going to say, no. These people are prepared to do enormous damage without care of the consequences to the party, which perhaps is less important, but to the Prime Minister and to the stability of government. And I'm afraid, some of us on the other side are not quite as we don't willingly want to do that. And I think a stable government, whatever you might think about the government, is a very important thing for this country to have. I don't think we need an early election. I don't think we need a leadership contest. And I'm afraid some colleagues of mine have been totally without regard to the sort of what am I looking for? What's the word I'm looking for? I suppose the success of the Conservative Party in appealing to, I think, the mainstream British politics for 25 years. And that's what makes me so angry about the fact that the government has accepted those amendments. We've had this debate. We've gone round and round the houses. We know what happens. We looked at 1997, 13 years out of power, and sadly it could happen. It absolutely could happen again. And so I think we are all extremely angry that Chequers was a very serious attempt by the Prime Minister, as you say, to have an opening position, a proper discussion with the EU. And just over a week later, some people in my party to find it acceptable to put down wrecking amendments to Chequers.
But if your opponents are playing chicken, don't you have to respond in kind? Or
well, I would watch this space.
Okay. All right. You said before that you're not a natural rebel. Can you expand on that?
Well, I think for the reason that I've just spoken about, actually. I mean, I think for people who aren't involved in politics, firstly, we're all completely mad. And you've got to be slightly bonkers to be involved in a political party. And I have lots of friends who look at me and go, glad you're doing it. Can't think of anything worse, frankly. But it is a tribal thing. And I joined the Conservative Party when I was 16. I have grown up in the Conservative Party. I met my husband in the party. He's a leader of a district council. I have friends whose weddings and christenings and divorces, all through politics, I know them, and I've lived through that experience with them. Some of them are in the House of Commons now, people I knew at university and all the rest of it. So actually, to knowingly do something. Well, but Dan's wife and I, Sarah, get on. We're great friends, and that's the point actually about it, is that even at its height, a couple of months ago, when a number of us decided to sign a letter on fixed odds betting terminals, it was Ian Duncan-Smith that coordinated that, and I was very happy to sign. So that tribal thing, and I think we see this play out in the Labour Party as well. There are plenty of Labour sensibles, and you think, why are they still there? But because of the tribal thing, actually. So to vote against your own party and to do damage potentially to your own party is not something I think that most people, although as I say there appear to be some who pay little regard to it, most people want to do. It's a very, very tough ask to do something in such a high profile way. So that's why I'm not natural. I would much prefer to try to get people together to move in a direction and to be thinking about the message we're sending out to the outside world, not constantly be talking to ourselves, which after 2 years is incredibly wearying and boring.
What do you think will be worse for this country, a hard Brexit or a Corbyn government? I ask simply because it might appear to some on your benches that this is going to be the choice come the end of this year when a deal comes before Parliament.
Well, I think both would be incredibly damaging. I think the worst thing that we could do would be to have a hard Brexit and then hand the country a Corbyn government on top. I think that would be an absolute catastrophe for this country and deeply, deeply unfair to the electorate. But again, I go back to some of my colleagues who appear to think that actually, it is worth playing with fire, destabilising the government, destabilising the leadership, and I fundamentally disagree with them on that.
Okay, and one of the curious things that's happened, it was happening before the referendum because Corbyn was elected before the referendum, is that politics is changing in front of our eyes, and the basis of support for both the big parties is changing. Do you know as a Conservative who the core constituency of your party is anymore?
Well, I think the core constituency of my party are the people in the what I call the centre ground of British politics. So in my constituency, and I suspect other MPs do this, I have a couple of streets or areas that I would regard as my swing voters. And I regard my swing voters as people who voted Labour for the 13 years, probably enthusiastically in 97. They did it in 01, they did it in 05, and then in 2010, actually, there was another offer on the table, and they felt it was time to give the other guys a go. In a seat like Loughborough, where the Liberal Democrats tend to come very much a third place, I'd regard some of them as well as people who would want just a sensible mainstream government to tackle many of the issues that they most care about, which is things like cost of living, NHS, education, quality of schools, and I do think social care. And I mentioned this, and I know it's not a great, it's not one of those great political issues that gets the leader writers going, but it is incredibly important in this country, and we are not tackling it properly. We're waiting for the government green paper on that. So I know I have the streets in my mind. I know where people live, and I will go and knock on doors. Exactly what I did in 2017. When it was all a bit too good to be true, I went in the 2017 election with a 9,000 plus majority, and I was told, no, you're not target seat, go and help in Nottingham and elsewhere. But no MP should ever completely not visit their constituency in the middle of a general election. So I was like, right, a couple of nights a week we're going to go and walk the streets, and we're not going to do the targeting, which central office tell you, knock on this door and that door, and you've got street full of 100 houses, and you're knocking on 30 of them. Just go and knock on every single door. And I remember in one of my towns, and I 2 days before the election, I knocked on the doors of people who because you've done it a few times, I've been there 14 years now, so there are houses where I know who lives there, I know the reaction I think I'm going to get. And it was, hello, Mrs. Morgan, nice to see you. Haven't made my mind up yet. Right, it's 2 days before the election. Oh, hello, Mrs. Morgan, nice to see you. Yeah. Been a difficult campaign, haven't made my mind up yet. And it took me a while to work out what was going on. I haven't made my mind up yet is the very polite British way for saying, thank you, but no, you don't have my support this election. Because actually most people, unless they're raving opposition members who delight in telling me, you must be joking, I'd never vote for you in a million years. Most of people are very polite and don't want to particularly have a political conversation on the doorstep. And that was when I could see things were changing. That's my core vote. That's who my party should be appealing to, not chasing off, I'm afraid, to the right and to UKIP. And I feel very, very strongly about that. And that's what I see part of my role as being, is to remind my party about that at every opportunity.
So, let me put it crudely, you think the party would be better off trying to regain Canterbury than trying to hang on to Mansfield?
Yeah.
Okay, so the northern strategy, that whole...
Well, I think, the difficulty is, I think there is a problem with us not having a voice in cities, northern cities, many different parts of the country. But actually, I think ultimately there are different ways of appealing to people. What people want is, as I say, is a practical, pragmatic, sensible government with answers to some of the issues we talked about as to why people ended up voting in the referendum. So I don't think it's a question. I'm always slightly reluctant with this. When I was selected for the candidate in Loughborough, I took a seat I took from Labour. I said there are no-go areas. Mm-hmm. So actually, I think that someone like a Ben Bradley, regardless of having a Brexit-type campaign, actually a really active candidate like that, running in a seat where the Labour MP hadn't been active for quite a long time, could still, even with my strategy, do very well in a seat like that.
I mean, you spoke eloquently a few minutes ago about the Conservative family that you're part of. And yet, in the last few months, you've shared platforms with people like David Miliband. Have we reached the point where you think you've got more in common with Chuka than you have with Jacob Rees-Mogg?
Well, I was at university with Jacob. And the honest truth is no. I think there is still a fundamentally different outlook on life between the way I see things and the way I think Jacob sees most things that we'd agree on, and the way that Chuka and others do. I think that, obviously I was part of the coalition government, so which I think worked remarkably well and was remarkably stable for 5 years, much against most people's expectations, where people expected it to fall apart after a couple of years. But no, I still, maybe to the upset of some people in this room or some people watching or whatever, I'm still very much a Conservative. I intend to stay in the Conservative Party, and I intend to fight for my kind of conservatism.
But would you accept that the ideological chasm at the heart of the Conservative Parliamentary Party is about as wide as it's been in recent times? And I don't just mean on Brexit. No.
I'm not sure it is on other things. You're right, there's an issue obviously about tax rises.
Agriculture. The future of agriculture. Should we cut tariffs? Should we stop support for farmers?
Well, I'm not entirely sure. We've had that sort of big debate within the party. I mean, this is part of the problem, actually. Alison McGovern, one of my the Labour members of the Treasury Select Committee, describes it as the Brexit bandwidth problem. And I think that is an issue. The fact that government, as going back to what I was saying before, all of government is so consumed by Brexit that actually having debates within the party and elsewhere about these other issues is very, very difficult to secure the time and the bandwidth for. I think there is there is definitely a debate to be had about tax rises in terms of funding for the NHS and elsewhere. I think that there are still some strong Conservative instincts, and that's part of the reason I wrote the letter, is to remind people we are a pro-business, pro-enterprise party. But yes, I mean, I think we are going through one of our periodic bouts where there are a lot of differences of opinions within the party. That's not a bad thing. The issue is how you resolve them and who it is that's trying to bring people together.
Was the 2017 manifesto recognisably a Conservative manifesto for you?
Well, it was interesting, wasn't it? I mean, it was a very different kind of manifesto, and I think there is a sort of civic conservatism, a sort of Chamberlainism that obviously Nick Timothy very much espoused. And I'm not entirely... I don't find that, that's not so much of a problem for me, because I do think it responds to some of the things that, again, people voted for Brexit for, which was actually feeling that maybe things had gone a little bit too far in terms of being very much a kind of people on their own, a very pro-business manifesto. I think you have to explain. I mean, we're not very good sometimes in politics about explaining why we care about things. Why do we think that capitalism, is right? Why do we think it's important to have businesses setting up and paying taxes and employing people, and explain to people that economic life cycle of a sort of enterprising and innovative economy?
Can you see circumstances, I mean, for all the tribalism, can you see circumstances by the time we get to autumn where a coalition of Labour and Conservative MPs basically impose a soft Brexit on the Prime Minister?
I think that is certainly a possibility. It's not going to come from the front benches, so it's not going to come from working with the Labour front bench. But as I say, I think one of the questions, whether it's identified this week or in the autumn, is where is the majority in Parliament for Brexit, the type of Brexit? So, for example, there is clearly a majority in Parliament for the UK being members of a customs union. The question is, at what point is that demonstrated?
And is there a lot of talk now between the backbenchers, if you like, about...
More so than there's ever been. I mean, I think there's always been in terms of, and I'll explain this to people when I go and talk about Parliament generally, things like select committees, all-party groups. Actually, the way you get stuff done in Parliament is by often working on a cross-party basis. And that's actually very powerful. But yes, I mean, I think because Brexit, as I say, has cut across party lines, there are obviously Brexiteers in the Labour Party, perhaps fewer of them, but they are there. And obviously there are, whether you would call us soft Brexiteers or former Remainers or whatever it is in the Conservative Party. So yes, but I think, I mean, that in a way it should be. Brexit is the biggest thing we have confronted as a country in terms of setting our place in the world, our future relationship with our closest and near neighbours. But we saw from Trump's visit last week actually how Brexit is also impacting. So I was with the Treasury Select Committee, I was in Washington in April, and we met sort of senior people from the Treasury Department out there, and they were fascinated. Tell us about Brexit, what's happening, what's like to happen. So it's having ripples across the whole world. So in a way you kind of think, actually, it should be cross-party, because this is a big, big issue, and I think people out there would expect their politicians to work on a cross-party basis to get some consensus.
When you look round the table at the liaison committee, do you sometimes feel that, like, all the best players are on the subs bench? That, you have so many high-caliber MPs now who aren't on the front benches but are leading select committees.
Well, it's kind of, I suppose I suppose I sort of feel that's for other people to say. But I think I am struck by looking particularly at the Labour benches that actually some of their most talented people are not in the shadow front bench. I think we're probably very, very grateful for that. But yeah, I mean, I think there's also been a deliberate attempt certainly by the House and by the Speaker, to make select committees and chairing select committees an alternative career to a ministerial career. And in my case, it's almost been longer than my ministerial career, so there's something in that.
Or a build-up to a next ministerial career.
Well, who knows? I mean, I think that's the thing. You can't plan it. I say to people, working in Westminster is an extraordinary place. It is a working environment like no other. That doesn't make it better, because I think there are problems with it. But it is extraordinary. And you don't plan. You don't apply for promotions. You don't do this, that, and the other. It is just a very, very strange working environment.
So I want to sort of end where we began with Justin Greening.
Right.
And her article today saying we should have it. What were your thoughts when you read that?
Well, I mean, my thoughts actually were good for Justine for for being so bold, actually, and putting her ideas out there. And actually, I think Justine talks an enormous amount of sense just generally. I think she's always one of those people I remember in Cabinet who will sort of cut through a lot of waffling from other people. She's a very active constituency member of Parliament. You know, when I meet friends who live in Putney, they all know her, or they've been to things where she's been at. So she's very good about saying, look, this is what I think, the person in the street is thinking, which I think is very important. I'm not convinced of the benefits of a second vote, I have to say. I think that the first has been so divisive, and I think it's saying something if our politicians cannot sort out this and the future relationship. That makes me very depressed about what Parliament is there for, and I think we should be able to step up to the plate and sort this out. But it's going to be messy, and I think that's what we're seeing play out at the moment.
What sort of Brexit is there a majority for in Parliament?
Well, that I think is that sweet spot is what we need to find. I think we all have our hunches about what it is, and that's where you see amendments going down and things is trying to identify that. Because contrary to popular belief, I know that there is a view that actually Parliament is completely unrepresentative. But going back to where we started, I think we are all constituency members of Parliament, and we do spend an awful lot of time receiving inbound correspondence in different ways from constituents, doing surgeries, going to events, and all the rest of it. So if you're doing your job properly as a member of Parliament, you should be in touch with what people are thinking, and particularly outside London and the South East, where views can be very, very different. I think although it sort of suits some people to say, oh, it's a majority of Remainers in Parliament, blah, blah, actually, if that were the case, we'd all have said, well, no, we don't accept the result, we want to remain. People are not saying that. MPs are not saying that. Even Ken Clarke says, we are leaving the EU. Anna was very clear about that today when she spoke. But the question, as I say, is how we're going to do it, how we're going to find that sweet spot.
Is there not a danger, whatever deal the Prime Minister comes back with, Jeremy Corbyn whips his MPs to vote against it because they want to vote against the government? There is
a danger with that, and I think that's a question that Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour front bench, his members will have to answer. And because I go back to what I said about Brexit being bigger, it's about the national interest, but absolutely, I mean that is very much a danger, and I know that the government whips are very, very obviously aware of that.
And you see, well, not no merit, but very little merit in the argument that the people having voted to leave now have a right to decide the terms under which we leave.
I do see some merit in that argument, and I can, but I think there was going to be one vote. The people have had their say. Do you leave? Do you remain? We are leaving. The question is how. And I think I had an email today from a constituent who said who'd read the article and who said, okay, well I'm interested, but if we're going to have another vote, we need to be far better informed, all of us, before we vote. He felt that he just didn't have enough facts before he voted in 2016. And I suspect there are millions of people like that. And actually, though you do hear the argument, it's all a bit complicated. I wish you hadn't given us the vote, at all, from some people. As I say, frankly, we have a representative democracy. Of course I do, absolutely. Right. But we have a representative democracy, and that representatives, I think, now have got to step up to the plate on this.
If we did have another referendum, who should lead the campaign to remain?
I haven't even thought about it.
Hypothetically.
No, I haven't. Honestly, I haven't even thought about it. I mean, I think it would be difficult. You're going to just throw a few names out there randomly and wait for me to land on one. Yeah, exactly. No, I haven't even thought about it. I just think, again, I think there's, one of my philosophies in life is worry about what you need to worry about. And actually, the big issue for an MP like me at the moment is, just looking at time, is what's going on in the House of Commons and how are we going to find, as I say, that sweet spot of where the majority is to get, to support the Prime Minister and to get the sensible Brexit deal on the table.
All right, we've got 2 minutes. I'm going to ask you the most important questions.
Right,
okay.
These are the
ones we listen to. Beer or Burgundy?
Burgundy.
Beatles or the Stones?
Stones.
Good for you. Cheddar or Camembert?
Cheddar.
Oasis or Blur?
Oh, God, neither.
Oh, good Lord. Beef bourguignon or steak and ale pie?
Oh, beef bourguignon.
There we go, populism. UK in a changing Europe or any other think tank you can mention?
Now, let me think about that. UK in a changing Europe.
Nicky, we are really grateful because we know it's a really difficult day, but we would like to present you your very own beer and Brexit tank. Thank you so much for coming along tonight. It's been brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. My wine in there.